The NFL salary cap is increasing at least $20 million from last year to this year, which means more money for the Chicago Bears to spend in free agency, but also more money for everyone else.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1, and you can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On the show today, we look at what this increase in salary cap means for the Chicago Bears and how it affects Ryan Poles' plans for this offseason. Yes, it's more money for the Bears, but it's also more money for everyone else. But that doesn't mean it's an equal benefit to every team, because some teams end up getting more salary cap space through some weird salary cap rules. Some teams already had a bunch of cap space, so what does a little more space mean? Other teams need every penny they can get, and it's going to shape some of the biggest names in free agency, some of the biggest names on the trade market connected to the Chicago Bears, and generally the supply and demand dynamics of the upcoming free agent market. I think the big takeaway right away for me is not that, add X million dollars to every free agent contract you were projecting before, because all those players are now about to get a bunch more money. I think we can take a brief step back and look at this and say, first of all, the increase of about $20 million or so, it's not exact yet, but they gave a range of what it could be. We were already operating under a fairly similar number. So, not to get too lost in the nitty gritty here, but like most of the online salary cap websites were projecting that the salary cap would be $275 million. The projection is now when the NFL releases, between $277 and $281. So it's anywhere from $2 to $7 million more than what we were already expecting it to increase. Like, all of the salary cap projections have been projecting an increase. This is just slightly more of an increase than what we were already projecting. So it's not as though we thought it would be flat and go over the same thing from year to year. It's not that it's going to be $20 million higher than we thought it would be. It ends up being, $5 million higher than we thought it would be. We just thought it wouldn't quite increase as much as it's going to. So it's not as though everything gets thrown into whack and no one has any idea that everyone just got all this extra cash, but it is going to be some extra money for every single team to be able to spend. And when I look at the upcoming free agent market, I think generally the players that are going to benefit the most from this are not the top of the market guys, but actually the second tier and middle tier free agents, because of how these negotiations tend to go. So, right, when we think about Trey Smith at the top of the free agent guard market, he's expected to get a contract that may make him the highest paid guard in NFL history. I think right now the biggest contracts, right, are like about $20 million a year is kind of the starting point we talk about for someone like Trey Smith. This kind of salary cap increase isn't going to make him jump to $25 million. You know what I mean? Like, because in these negotiations, right, your starting point is what the last highest paid guy is. And then it's like, okay, well, can you pay me a little more than the last highest paid guy? And just because teams got a few more $1 million in salary cap space this year doesn't mean that you're going to give Trey Smith an extra $5 million a year, because it's all sort of already determined a little bit by the market of like, well, the highest paid guards are here, so we're only going to give you a little bit more above that. Most teams are not going to want to just completely reset the market by bumping up way above what anybody else has ever gotten paid for. They're going to keep it tied to where the current ceiling on the market is right now. That's not the case, though, for the lower level free agents. Like, yeah, teams are going to say, listen, Trey Smith, we're going to make you the highest paid guard, but that, we'll bump you up by a couple million a year, but not like $5 million a year. But if I'm one of these second tier players, right, there's no ceiling there. They're not at that top end line. So if I'm someone who's like Kevin Zeitler from the Detroit Lions at guard, or Mekhi Becton from the Philadelphia Eagles, or even Tevin Jenkins from the Chicago Bears, this increases my price tag more than it increases the price tag of the guys at the top, because you don't want to break precedent with the guys at the top. But the guys in the middle, well, if Tevin Jenkins gets an extra $3 million a year more because of the salary cap increase, like that's not going to reshape the whole market, right? It's the contracts at the top that then set the market below it. But the guys that are already in the middle tier here can now get more money because there is more money to go around, and it's not going to affect other deals nearly as much when it's not going to be structured by the guys at the top, right? Like this is where the distinction lies here. Trey Smith isn't going to totally reset the guard market, but giving Tevin Jenkins an extra $3 million a year or whatever also isn't going to reset the guard market. If he gets, I don't know what the numbers are going to be. If he gets $16 million a year now instead of $13 million a year, there's not going to be this ripple effect. Teams are going to be more willing to pay out extra money to a player there because it's not then raising everybody else's price tag underneath it the way that the very, very top of the market sets that high bar, and then everyone is sort of delineated down from that. So I don't think the likes of Trey Smith at guard, or, look at the defensive end position, right? Somebody like Josh Sweat or Khalil Mack that are going to be, closer to the top of their respective salary cap markets for their positions. Like those guys aren't going to get these big bumps in money. Whatever that highest paid player in the league is right now sets that mark for how these top line negotiations go. But it's the middle class of free agents where there's a lot more wiggle room and room for negotiation and arguments to be made about, well, I'm just as good as this player who makes X amount of money, or I'm better than this player who makes X amount of money, and so I deserve to be paid more. And it's not going to shake up as much of the rest of the market underneath it, because everyone's still going to be sort of pinging off of where the top is and then how far this player is from the top. Like that's the anchor point from a negotiation standpoint. And so I think it's these middle tier free agents that stand to benefit the most from this increase rather than the guys at the top. And certainly, the guys at the bottom, the veteran minimum is set based on the salary cap. So all the veteran minimum contracts get bumped up a little bit, but that's not really that big of a difference for these guys. So I think this just makes life a little bit more difficult than for someone like Ryan Poles, where if you don't want to spend the top contract on Trey Smith, or you don't want to spend the top contract on, Josh Sweat, or, one of these top pass rushers, then if you're looking for somebody like Becton or Zeitler or Brandon Scherf or Evan Brown from the Arizona Cardinals, like all those guys now cost a little bit more than they were going to. I don't think Trey Smith costs a ton more. He was already going to cost a lot. I don't think it moves the needle that much on him, but it moves the needle a bit more on the contracts lower down in the list of free agents that are kind of in that more middle tier stuff. You also will then have more teams with more money to bid on free agents. That you may have had teams that, well, we couldn't afford Trey Smith before, but now that we've got an extra $5, $6, $7 million in salary cap space, now we can actually get in on that negotiation. So it has the potential to add more bidders to those top contracts, and really to any contracts, because there's a bunch of teams that were already in some salary cap trouble that are now in less salary cap trouble. There were teams that were tight on the salary cap that now have a bit more breathing room, and there were teams that had a bunch of salary cap space and now have even more extra money that they can throw around and get in on some of these big contracts. I think as a result, we also see more opportunity for teams to make the kinds of splash trades that previously didn't seem as possible because of salary cap issues. And same thing for the franchise tag and the transition tag that are expensive, but now you've got more room to potentially absorb those bigger salary cap numbers, at least initially. So we'll go through how this salary cap increases affects the potential of like a Myles Garrett trade, or the transition tagging of a guard like Trey Smith, or the Eagles using a franchise tag on someone like Josh Sweat or Milton Williams, next on Locked On Bears. This is a message from sponsor Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back, and then waiting and wondering and worrying some more. But now Taxes is matching with a TurboTax expert who can do your taxes as soon as today. An expert who gives your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return, all while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert who will find you every deduction possible, file every form, every investment, everything with 100% accuracy so you can get back the most money possible, guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. Now this is taxes. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live full service. Real-time updates only in iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. Now that there's some more money for teams, there's more possibility for some of the big moves that have been rumored or speculated or discussed this offseason. I think this opens up the door specifically in the trade market, which then affects the free agent market. Because without getting too into the weeds on NFL contracts and salary here, one of the big challenges that makes it harder for a team like the Cleveland Browns to trade Myles Garrett, or the Dallas Cowboys to trade Micah Parsons, or the Bengals to trade T. Higgins, or whatever trade market might be out there, Aaron Rodgers and the Jets. One of the big obstacles here is that NFL teams on these contracts, right? You like to push money in the future and say, well, we'll pay you more in the future to pay you less now to create more salary cap space today. But in trade mechanics under the NFL collective bargaining agreement, when you trade a player's contract to another team, all of that money that you pushed into the future, that wasn't originally in the future, but you restructured into the future on the contract, that money then comes on your salary cap the moment you trade that player. So then, because you can't push the bill into the future and then trade him away and then pay that bill later for the player that's no longer a part of your team, that's been traded, his contract has been traded to another team. It's something they collectively bargain. So then what happens is, if you have a player like Myles Garrett of the Cleveland Browns, he already costs a certain amount of money. And then if you trade him, the future money on his contract that the Browns have already pushed away also stacks onto that today. And so, if the Browns wanted to trade Myles Garrett, it would increase the hit on their salary cap to trade him. They would have to pay more to the salary cap to trade him than they would to keep him. It would cost them more on a trade because they've already pushed some of that money into the future, and it comes up to the present day the moment you try to trade him. That's what's made a Myles Garrett trade not impossible, but extremely difficult up to this point. The Cleveland Browns are currently over the salary cap, and so they need to make moves to get under the salary cap just to be at zero, to be compliant with their current contracts. And then you want to add on top of that the extra money it would cost if you traded away Myles Garrett, and all of a sudden you're adding a bill on top of debt that you already have if you're Cleveland. Now, it's going to be a challenge for them with the Deshaun Watson contract to get under the salary cap as is, but if they were to trade Myles Garrett, I believe it would throw another $16 million extra onto their salary cap bill that they would have to try and then clear out to get back under the salary cap. The higher than expected salary cap increase, though, opens the door for that a little bit more. Not a lot, a bit more, but a little bit more. And the same thing is true for some other teams that we'll talk about. We'll start with the Myles Garrett as an example here. But because the salary cap is projected to increase more than we thought, the Browns were initially expected to be about $38 million over the salary cap, which is insane. And now they're projected to be more like $32 million over the salary cap, depending on where exactly that new salary cap number comes in. It's a projected range at this point. That's still a lot of money for the Cleveland Browns to be able to try and get out from underneath, but it becomes a more manageable approach with every extra dollar they get. And there's a guy I got a shout out on Twitter who put together a really nice graph that kind of tracks how much salary cap space each team is. His name is Sean Newkirk. And he goes through, there's some really complicated salary cap stuff that's even above my pay grade about not every team is going to get the same boost in salary cap space because of how contracts are structured as a percentage of salary cap and how NFL draft. The rookie contracts are structured as a percentage of salary cap. So depending on how different teams' assets are aligned, some teams will get more of a benefit than others. It's more complicated than it's worth getting into on the podcast here, but just know that however much the salary cap increases is not universal boost for every team involved. The Bears are going to get slightly less than some other teams, and a team like the Eagles is going to get way less, whereas teams like the Seahawks and Dolphins and others are going to get more than other teams just based on complicated salary cap rules that are not important to get into details of. But the fact that a team like the Browns now has a bump in salary cap space without a bump in price for Myles Garrett, right? Like the Browns have X amount of dollars and Myles Garrett costs X amount of dollars. And they just gave the Browns more dollars, but Myles Garrett's contract stays the same. The Browns have more cap space. Myles Garrett contract stays the same. So it becomes all of a sudden a little bit easier for a team like the Browns to clear out salary cap space, to find a way to get under the cap, and if they so chose, find a way to try and make a deal done with Myles Garrett. I think, to put a bow quick on Garrett before we move on to other players, the thing to keep in mind with Myles Garrett is if the Cleveland Browns are going to trade him, it will probably not happen until after June 1st. There's an NFL rule where anything that happens after June 1st, you get to spread out the salary cap on the current year, plus half of it on the current year, or not half of it, but some of it on the current year, and then some of it on the following year's salary cap. So instead of having to pay that bill all at once, you can have a payment plan and have it as a 2-year payment plan on the Myles Garrett bill if you traded him. And so I think if that was going to happen, to be after the draft, after June 1st, which makes it more difficult and more challenging. But something that feels a little bit more realistic than a Myles Garrett deal is this salary cap space increase giving the Kansas City Chiefs more room to re-sign or tag Trey Smith, and giving the Philadelphia Eagles more room to get a deal done or tag their upcoming free agents that the Chicago Bears might be interested in. Because again, if we look at how much of a boost these teams are going to get from an increase in the salary cap, the Kansas City Chiefs were previously projected to be over the cap by about $3.5 million. But with this extra bump, they're projected to be under the cap by about $4 million. They're going to gain about $8 million in effective salary cap space because of this bump up for the league. And so while the $4 million in space they have right now is not enough to re-sign or franchise tag Trey Smith, all of a sudden that's an extra $8 million that you don't have to clear to try and re-sign a player like this. It's like a free salary cap casualty. It's a free player you get to cut, right? It's like a free $8 million out of your debt to now put you in the positive. So that then, if, say, Travis Kelce retires, I believe that clears up another, $15 million for the Kansas City Chiefs in the salary cap, or something like $17 million, something along those lines, if Travis Kelce were to get cut because he's got a roster bonus, or to retire because he's got a roster bonus coming up here. And then all of a sudden they've got $20 million in cap space. And then, they could choose to cut someone like, Joe Thuney, or they could restructure contracts on their team. Like you could restructure Patrick Mahomes' contract, or Chris Jones' contract, or Jawan Taylor's contract. And all of a sudden the Kansas City Chiefs could create $20, $30, $40 million in cap space to either use the tag on Trey Smith and negotiate a contract, use the tag on Trey Smith to trade him, or just sign him to a contract extension as is. Like that job for them becomes a lot easier. Same thing for the Philadelphia Eagles that go from what they were projected to be about $13 million in cap space. They jump up to $17 million in cap space. Is that the difference by itself between being able to re-sign Josh Sweat and Milton Williams or not? Maybe not alone, but again, it reduces that barrier for all of these teams. Now, if those players hit the open market, there's their contract value goes up a little bit more. But if you're re-signing them short, your teams have more money, but if there's no open market negotiations, all you're negotiating with that player on is based on current existing contracts, right? If you're negotiating with Josh Sweat, you're comparing him to all the other defensive end contracts. And those aren't going to change between now and free agency starting. So just because the Eagles have more salary cap space doesn't necessarily mean his contract number, his price tag is going to go up that much until he can get to the open market and negotiate against other teams that have a lot more salary cap space and might be willing to pay him more. So I think this bump up makes it so the Bears will have more competition from the existing teams, more competition from the Chiefs for Trey Smith, from the Eagles for their free agents, for the Browns. Maybe it makes it a more possibility for trading someone like Myles Garrett. But I think this increase makes it more likely that a splash trade will happen, and more likely that teams will be able to re-sign their own players and use franchise tags and transition tags on their players. Again, it's not drastic. It's not like we're going to see 15 moves happen all because of this little bit, but it just makes everyone's moves a little bit easier with their own players on their own teams. It also means that maybe some of these teams that already have some salary cap space won't need to make as many salary cap casualty cuts. And that's going to change the supply and demand of the open free agent market and maybe make life more difficult for the Chicago Bears. We'll look at how that might affect their plans this offseason next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. When the game tips off, it's just getting started in the NBA, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because with FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game. So even if you miss that opening tip-off, or you just want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. So whether you want to bet on the run-up to the playoffs after the All-Star break, or you can bet on the hockey season, tennis, soccer, boxing, when baseball comes right back around, you can bet on that as well. And of course, football is always possible. You can prop bets on the NFL draft and free agency all in FanDuel in the app that's super easy to use. And when you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. If the Chicago Bears now have an extra $6 or $7 million in salary cap space, as it's projected right now, they're expected to get about $6.8 million in bonus salary cap space to go from roughly $54 million to roughly $60.5 million in salary cap space. That extra $6.88 million could be the difference between a salary cap casualty and keeping a player that you may have otherwise considered moving on from because of how much his contract was going to cost you. So I think about someone like DeMarcus Walker on the defensive line. If the Bears released DeMarcus Walker, they would save $5.25 million. Well, they just saved almost $7 million from the cap going up. So maybe they look at it and say, yeah, you know what? We can afford that. We can afford to keep this player around at that price, and we don't need to deplete that talent on our roster in order to free up more space for other moves. Or somebody like Kevin Byard, we've talked about as a possibility. If the Bears cut him, they'd save $7 million on the salary cap. They're just getting about $7 million. So they just added one Kevin Byard's worth of salary cap space because of the projected increase in revenues that allow them to be more flexible in some of those roster choices. The problem that creates, though, is that the same thing becomes true with other teams. And so if other teams make fewer salary cap casualty cuts because they've got more space to just keep guys that they otherwise may have cut to increase cap space, that then means fewer guys enter the free agent market. And when fewer players enter the free agent market, then there is less supply for the same amount of demand, right? I guess in some ways, there's also a little bit less demand because when you create a salary cap casualty, you also usually need to replace that player, although you're trying to replace that player for less salary, so the demand is not exactly the same. And in some cases, you already have the replacement already on your roster. But the point being, the Bears have been able to take advantage of salary cap casualties in the past. Look no further than Kevin Byard. He was a player who was traded, from the Titans to the Eagles 2 years ago. And then at the end of the season, the Eagles released Kevin Byard. He was not a street free agent whose contract expired, but he was cut to save salary cap money. The Bears were then able to sign Kevin Byard before free agency actually even started, so they could get that Eddie Jackson replacement in place before the Wild West of wide open free agent. I mean, yes, anybody was able to negotiate with Kevin Byard, but nonetheless, they got the deal done before they could talk to other free agents and secured that spot on their team at a fairly reasonable price. The other key thing for salary cap casualty players is that they don't count towards the compensatory pick formula. So when the Bears signed Kevin Byard, it didn't affect their ability to try and get compensatory picks. Now, they didn't end up getting any compensatory picks because they still signed a lot of other free agents, but it's an important, not loophole, but it's a market inefficiency that smart teams take advantage of. When you sign other teams as cap casualties, they don't count towards your free agent formula. So if you don't end up signing a lot of real free agents, but you sign a bunch of salary cap free agents, you can still get compensatory picks and still get to sign outside players to big contracts. It's a little bit of a hack. The idea here also is that salary cap casualty players are often players teams might want to keep around, just not at the price tag that they were currently under. But it's not as though this is a bad player that the team no longer wants. It's this player isn't quite living up to the contract this player's just not worth the deal that they were going for. As opposed to like free agents tend to be players that, hey, this team chose that they didn't want to re-sign this player. They could have re-signed this player. They could have negotiated with this player, but they decided it's not worth it for us to re-sign this player. They might not be as good as we want them to be. They might not be good enough for our team, and we want to replace them with someone else. But salary cap casualties are usually more like a decent player who's signed a contract early that paid them a lot of money, but now we're towards the end of that contract and they're just not worth that much money, but they're still really good players. And they still often come then at a discount, at a good value. Kevin Byard, at least this past season, was a good value for the Chicago Bears. They signed him to a 2-year deal, but they backloaded it. So the first year was $6.5 million. The second year is $8.5 million, right? $6.5 million was a decent price. $8.5 million becomes less nice of a price for Kevin Byard. Like, that's where you can find deals, and that's where if teams have more cap space and make fewer cap casualties, then they won't have as many of those players available to potentially go out and sign. It also then leaves more room for teams to potentially try and restructure those contracts and move money around. If you have more money to work with now, then you can absorb more of that if you need to move dollars around to make contracts work and to keep players around. And it allows teams to then get in on more of the spending action here. That teams can get in on negotiations with these players and bid up the price that they wouldn't have otherwise necessarily been in on, because there is slightly less supply. And so there's the same number of teams competing for maybe fewer players if fewer of them are salary cap casualties. Like, when the Bears signed Kevin Byard as a cap casualty free agent last season, that meant the Bears then got that deal done before free agency started, and they weren't negotiating with other safeties in the free agent market, these other starting safeties. Of course, they signed Jonathan Owens, but like the point being, right, like that took one player, one bidder out of the bigger free agent safety market there, so that the Bears didn't really end up pursuing guys like Xavier McKinney, who goes from the Giants to the Green Bay Packers, or Darnell Savage goes from the Packers to the Jaguars, or Geno Stone to the Bengals. And a bunch of these safeties changed teams last year. The Bears already made their signing to get a starting safety before free agency started. So the Bears weren't there to drive up the price tag for the Packers to get McKinney. They weren't there to drive up the price tag for the Rams to get Cameron Curl from Washington. Some of the other safeties we talked about last offseason, Bears got out of that beforehand, and that reduces then the demand and as a result, like the price. But when there's fewer cap casualties to sign, then you don't take that demand away, and then you don't have the supply to take that demand away. So then you have the same number of teams competing for fewer or lesser players, which then can drive that price tag up just a little bit higher. So that's where everything gets a little bit more expensive. And again, a lot of that ends up being more of the middle class, second and third tier free agents, as opposed to the true guys at the top, who will also get more money. But I think the bigger jump, certainly from a percentage standpoint, are going to be the players, in the $10 to $15 million range, not the $20+ million range players. Like that's where the NFL economics starts to trickle down a little bit when the salary cap goes up the way it is. We'll see when the exact salary cap projection comes out. Right now, they're saying a range between, I think, 277 to 281. So it could go up a plus or minus, $4 million from where we think it could go up at this point. So that's going to be interesting to keep tabs on. And we'll see how that increase in salary cap affects decisions on guys like Trey Smith, like Myles Garrett, like maybe even Micah Parsons or Josh Sweat or Milton Williams. Any and all major updates we get on those players, you can be sure we'll break it down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit the subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, because that's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks for making Locked On Bears a part of your listening habit whenever you can. If you want to look for a second listen today, you can check out the Locked On NFL podcast for more salary cap and league-wide NFL talk. You can also check out any of the other Locked On Podcast Network podcasts covering all of your favorite teams every day. Just make Locked On Bears your first listen once again tomorrow for another opportunity to bear down.